It's just about being able to recognize that, hey, my brain works differently and there's nothing wrong with that, but maybe I need to set up X, Y, and Z in order to function in optimal ways, right?
It's not just about how that individual interacts with the environment and with the people in their environment. It's also about how the brain is actually processing the environment.
If I were allowed to show up as my whole self from the beginning, maybe I wouldn't have trauma and PTSD and anxiety and depression and being diagnosed as narcissistic or borderline, right?
So let's talk about what your brain's doing and what your partner's brain is doing and how that's different.
The world is not built for us. It would not be this hard if it were that easy.
Hello, everybody. My guest today is Gwen Janssen. She's a nurse and an adjunct professor, and she's a longtime leader with over 16 years in healthcare who was diagnosed with ADHD in her early 30s. Gwen has 2 master's degrees and a doctorate in progress. Go, Gwen. All with a focus on leadership, which she tells me is her passion. She actually founded the END Institute, that's spelled E-N-D, which stands for Excellence in Neurodiversity. She founded this institute after her diagnosis as a way to help educate and advocate for other neurodiverse professionals and leaders. Gwen focuses heavily on creating spaces for psychological safety and development based on the unique strengths and support needs of the neurodiverse community. She's also the author of ADHD, How to Go from Powerless Professional to Powerhouse Leader, which is due out in May of 2023. So we're looking forward to that. And you're going to really enjoy the conversation that Gwen and I have today. I would really just love for you to share more about you and how you got into this world of neurodiversity in professionally, personally. How is it important to you?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am Gwen Janssen. I am a nurse by training. I have been in maternity healthcare for over 15 years now. I was lucky that I knew that was always my passion, what I wanted to do. Through my nursing career, I was actually able to move into nursing leadership, which unlocked a new kind of passion for me in leadership. I really enjoyed doing that work, especially in the lens of healthcare and beyond. I've held a few different roles within the healthcare space in addition to nursing leadership. I've done some non-clinical director work, and now I work on the medical industry side, functioning as a clinical expert for a medical device company. I've always been somebody that had a really strong work ethic, very ambitious. I have a bachelor's and 2 master's degrees, with my master's both focusing on healthcare leadership and administration. But I always felt like something was a little bit off, right? I was working really hard, always giving it 110%, reading tons of books about personal development, professional development. Like I said, I went and got all these degrees, right? I'm trying to put the pieces together for why something just doesn't seem to be clicking and could never find the answer, right? It always came back down to, well, you're just not trying hard enough, or you're just not the right fit for this or for that. Or, oh, leaders, my nephew was diagnosed with ADHD at actually a pretty young age, right? Had gone through a lot of this diagnosis and that diagnosis, anxiety, depression. At one point, I was told, we think you might have borderline personality disorder, right? All of these different things where I'm ping-ponging back and forth. Same deal, right? Don't really have the answers that I'm looking for. Nothing ever really seemed to make sense. And then I believe my nephew was either 3 or 4 when his pediatrician first mentioned it to us. Because I remember the first time that my sister said that to me, I was like, that's ridiculous. He's a baby. And then as he continued to struggle, I started to do more and more research on ADHD, right? And I was truly blown away by what I found. I can't really overstate how profound it was to discover the reality of ADHD, right? My nephew presents in kind of stereotypical ADHD way where, bless his little heart, that boy, he's got the attention span of a gnat and he struggles in class, all the things that we're taught to expect when we hear ADHD. And then
thank you so much to all of my guests of season 3 of the Your Neurodiverse Relationship podcast. These folks are bringing their lives to you to help all of you out there who are trying to figure out your own relationships. If you'd ever be interested in being on a podcast, just email us at gethelp@jodicarlton.com. Also, be sure to visit me online at jodicarlton.com to see all the resources that I have available to you. Until next time.
Through the research that I was doing, I discovered the different types of ADHD and all of the nuances in the presentations and symptoms, right? And you find out with a strong genetic link within ADHD. I was having a talk with my sister and I'm like, I'm pretty sure you and I both have it, right? My sister and I are twins. The more that I read about this, I really think this is something that your son comes by honest because I'm pretty sure like that comes down from our side of the family. And so at that point, my sister and I both went to go get diagnosed. And through the diagnosis journey, it was shocking to me being someone that's worked in healthcare my whole career, how there's almost no standardization across the diagnostic process. It varies so much on where you live, who you go to see, and something like your insurance coverage. And then after that, the ADHD diagnosis was freeing in the sense that it made so many things make sense, right? There was that
Mhm.
that unlocked it all, that made everything else fall into place in a way that was truly an aha moment. However, then it's almost like one of those things where they're like, "Yay, good for you," and good luck with that. I'm used to reading research and
Mhm.
differentiate between what is quality research, what are reputable sources, and what's not. This was something I was passionate about, right? I want to find out everything that I can. I want to make it make sense for me and figure out how I can make it work. It was still very challenging and time consuming for me to put all of those resources together. When I started talking about my ADHD online, especially in the scope of how it's impacted me as a professional, it was really because I didn't know anybody that was like me. Through sharing my story, people have reached out to me in DMs or text messages. I've started to recognize, hey, this person did have ADHD and I just didn't know it because they didn't talk about it.
Or didn't
People
know it
saying,
themselves.
exactly, right? They're like, "Oh my god, I had no idea, but everything that you're saying is exactly what I've gone through."
Mhm.
So that was kind of the catalyst for me to start talking about it. It shouldn't be this hard, especially when we're talking about people that are ambitious. They want to figure out how to make their brain work for them. They're just not given the tools or the resources, or it's just not a common enough part of the conversation nowadays. I'm a little bit behind the 8 ball. I don't have TikTok because I'm not cool. I've heard ADHD is all over TikTok. Okay, that's fine. However, what kind of meaningful change is resulting from this awareness? Even when I was speaking to my therapist, who is a clinician, what she does, when I said to her for the first time, "Diana, I think I have ADHD," she's like, "No, maybe ADD." She didn't even know that there had been that nomenclature change. The terminology is different. ADHD is not even a thing anymore. Still had that same perception of like, you're not physically hyperactive. But
Right.
even took me educating her a little bit. That's what drives me to be really vocal about my experience because I think we deserve that. I think we deserve a sense of community, support, understanding, and advocacy because there's no reason for us to not reach the same level of success, have the same opportunities available to us. It's just about being able to recognize that, hey, my brain works differently and there's nothing wrong with that, but maybe I need to set up X, Y, and Z in order to function in optimal ways,
Mm.
right?
Oh my gosh. So much there. Thank you for sharing all of that. My journey has been similar to yours, but in the perspective of a parent who then started to recognize so many other people in my world are neurodiverse. That's something I want to talk to you about today. But first, I am a former clinician. I was a licensed therapist in Georgia for 20 years. And now I don't work under my licensure anymore. I coach worldwide and educate
Mhm.
worldwide. But at that time, like your therapist that you saw, my training about ADHD, ADD, autism was so limited. And we had these images of these little boys who are bouncing around the classroom and can't
Mhm.
focus. Girls never really entered the equation in the training, and definitely not adults. I don't know what the psychological community was thinking when they didn't recognize that these children grow up.
They thought for the longest time that we grew out of it,
Like,
particularly a childhood affliction.
there was this idea that the individuals who have the greater difficulties and challenges needing caregiver support are the only ones that were really considered to still be autistic or struggling in adulthood. What happened to all the others? My journey started with my daughter, who was diagnosed with autism at age 5. But then also as a therapist, seeing people in my practice did a lot of cognitive behavioral type work. So I'm getting a lot of people in there who are struggling with difficulty in executive function. Through the years, I did what you did, dove into the research, learned as much as I could about the autism side of things. But then as time went by, and I'm seeing sensory processing, I'm learning about sensory
Mhm,
processing from her. My son also has sensory processing difficulties and
mhm.
anxiety. It's interesting because neither one of them were ever diagnosed with ADD or ADHD. And he's not autistic, but she is. And I didn't really want to specialize because I was living it so much. And I just didn't even feel like I was capable of helping people because I was trying to figure it out myself. And then eventually, though, I remember a colleague said to me one time, Jodi, if not you, who? You are living it, which means you've got more frontline experience. That was like a light bulb going off for
Mm,
me. I hear your story all the time
mhm.
where a child is diagnosed or it's even grandchildren. I have grandparents who are coming to me in their 60s and 70s. I've even had some 80-year-olds actually come to me where their grandchildren or great grandchildren are being diagnosed, children, siblings, aunts, uncles, and then somebody's going, well, you're just like Uncle Bob. Okay, wait a minute. I recognize this. So my focus has ended up being in adult relationships. It's evolving because I used to focus on the partnership, the domestic partnership, marriages. But as I continue to work with these folks, it's really impossible for me to ignore the other relationships in their lives because everybody who is neurodivergent has family members who have some kind of neurodivergent. I may work with people who are actually meet criteria for autism. I don't do like official mental health diagnoses anymore, but I do some assessment. I help them figure out what's happening to give them a framework. But if somebody's diagnosed with autism, somebody in the family probably has ADD or at least sensory
Mhm.
processing or possibly autism because that executive dysfunction that we see in ADHD is also part of that whole autistic umbrella of executive dysfunction too. And sometimes people come to me with all these diagnoses. Like you said, bipolar is one, especially
Mhm.
for women. Men struggle between narcissistic and autistic. I see borderline personality, like you mentioned. The borderline and the narcissistic, all the personality disorders, those are such toxic personalities. And to get labeled as
Mhm.
borderline or narcissistic when really it's more about executive functioning and all these other parts of neurodiversity, it can
Well,
be
and taking into
devastating.
account the masking as well, right? So when we talk about borderline personality disorder, narcissism, and really all of these other things, that neurodiverse people are misdiagnosed with, how much of it I would love as our research evolves, I really want someone to do a study about how much of this misdiagnosis is related to the fact that because of the way that you show up in the world, is always told to you, shown to you that that's unacceptable, that's not appropriate, you know what I mean? That's not how normal people behave. And then you develop all of these compensatory mechanisms where you're masking your natural tendencies, behavior, and communication. You can only keep up that facade for so long. So, this balancing act of who I'm supposed to be and how I'm supposed to show up in the world versus what is natural to me to be and show up in the world. How much of that has to do with all of these labels that get put on us when realistically, if I were allowed to show up as my whole self from the beginning, maybe I wouldn't have trauma and PTSD and anxiety and depression and being diagnosed as narcissistic or borderline, right?
Yeah, my take on masking is that everybody masks. Everybody, all people mask. But the difference is a neurotypical person learns vicariously. When I say everybody masks, I mean everybody has different sub personas we
Mhm.
use in different settings. You're a
Yeah.
nurse, you've got that mask, you're a sister, you're an aunt, and it shifts depending on the setting we're in. For a neurotypical person, that's more learning how and when to do that. What it means is like an autopilot process that's just going on. Whereas people who are neurodivergent don't inherently understand or know how to mask, when to mask. And so it's a forced process. I'm in this situation, I have to mask this way. I'm in this situation, I have to mask that way. And in that, because it's so forced and not knowing when and where and how and who, then the true self totally does get lost. Like you're saying, it's like, when can I just be me? Is it okay to be me? Who am I? And sometimes when I say I'm neurotypical, I have so many people in my life who are neurodivergent, and we've talked about this so much. I know my neurodivergent folks are saying, "What should I
Mhm.
do? Should I smile right now? Should I laugh?" Like questioning what's the appropriate thing to do. When can I just take that mask off? When is a safe time to do it? When can I do it? It's just so difficult for people to know. And the other thing I want to say before I forget is I would love to see research done about the masking that's learned as a child from parents or from the environment that they're in, that's oftentimes taken on as the script to use. And when that parent or that early situation is dysfunctional, if there is a personality disorder there, or if there is just really dysfunctional childhood. I've had clients who do present as narcissistic. And even for me, I've become really skilled at recognizing personality disorders. And sometimes I'll have somebody who really seems like a personality disorder, but then the more I dig and investigate, it's not a personality disorder, it's a mask, like a scripted, this is the way I do
Mhm.
this, is the way I handle this. And when we start uncovering that it's a scripted mask, when that individual realizes how devastating those behaviors and that mask is to other people, they're horrified.
Mhm.
And whereas a true personality disorder does not react to the revelation, they react to it very differently. I'm literally seeing that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about that because I will say all credit to my mom. She raised my sister and I as a single parent with at least ADHD, maybe some other stuff going on, definitely trauma and maybe a little bit of PTSD as well. Not to take away from the difficulty and challenges of that experience, but we definitely grew up in a very broken type of situation. There was no healthy expression of emotions, and there was very little healthy communication. Growing up, I was not diagnosed with ADHD until age 33. So last
Mhm.
year was when I was diagnosed. I had made my way in this world for 33 years without having that information. Up until that point, it's really just trying to swim upstream and figure it out, which is then made even more challenging when you look at that through the lens of being raised in that type of environment where maybe some members of your family are not attempting to grow on that same path that you are, whether through set in their ways or they just don't know how. So maybe
Right.
not through any fault of their own, but then you are still exposed to all of these toxic kind of behaviors, emotional expressions, and communication, it can be extremely challenging. So, for
Mhm.
us, you were talking about earlier that grandparents are coming to you trying to figure out if maybe this is what's going on with them. That's what's happened with our mom. She was not by any means old when she had my sister and I, but she was a little bit older than some of our friends' parents. So, as a grandma, she is almost 70 now, with my nephew being almost 8. Through all the research that I've done on ADHD and through my sister's journey, realizing this is what's been going on with me. Of course, now we're talking about 70 years of lived experience, learned behavior, and etc. Now you have 3 generations in the mix that are all trying to figure it out and do the best that we can. Because my sister and I want much better for our nephew than what we had, right? At this point, even through treatment and everything like that, I would still call my nephew's ADHD pretty uncontrolled. He still experiences quite a few struggles. Where my sister and I were raised in this environment where we weren't taught how to communicate or behave in healthy ways within relationships, and how difficult it is to be that breaker of generational norms. It's a very challenging place to sit because
Mhm.
you try really hard to have this level of empathy. Despite how everything went, my mom tried her best.
Sure.
That doesn't change that it wasn't the best upbringing that we had, but I know that she tried her best. So you try
Sure.
to have this level of empathy. But then there's also this sense of kind of frustration and at times resentment. If I had known any of this stuff when I was younger, I would have had it easier. Maybe I would have been more well adjusted or better able to express my emotions in a healthier way and communicate in a healthier way. Where now we're trying to manage all of that while also giving my nephew a supportive and an empathetic environment as well.
I've had a similar experience in my own family as we've figured out the generations. For me, the neurodivergence that's in my family is on the autism side of this whole neurodivergence spectrum. But then some people in my family it's more about the sensory issues, some of the executive dysfunction that you see with ADHD. Sometimes we're all so close to the forest that we can't see the trees. I've known all about my daughter's issues. And then we started looking more back at the family. We look at my uncle and some of my other family members. And then my mom is like, she came and lived with us for 2 years because of COVID with my daughter, who's the one in the family who's been diagnosed at Vanderbilt Autism Research Institute. So she's living with her. Over the course of those 2 years, I'm emerging as this expert in the field. I talk about it at home, and my mom listens to my podcast, and she's like, I try some of this. And I'm just kind of like, oh, it's like what you said, though. For me, I think about being raised. My parents did the best they could. And that disclaimer comes out all the time. But like you said, it still doesn't change the impact of what happened. And that actually brings me around to a conversation that I saw on LinkedIn this week where there are folks who really want to step away from the medical model of diagnosis. And I completely understand where a lot of them are coming from. And it goes back to what you were just saying about being who we are and not having to mask, being our authentic self and being accepted for that and understood so that everybody can thrive. But there are some people who are advocating for just removing that label altogether, or not necessarily removing the label, but they were talking about early intervention and how they were against it. And I was like, hold on, no, I can't even get on board with that because of everything that you just said about not having that framework for generations and decades of your life. Like I said, I see people in their retirement years who are just now going, I wish I had this framework. I wish we in our relationships had this framework. So, what are your thoughts on early intervention or early detection, early diagnosis?
So you heard me say earlier that when the pediatrician tried to tell us that my nephew was 3 or 4 that he was AD, I was totally against it, right? Like they're just a bunch of pill pushers. They're trying to put this literal infant on the medications, and that's terrible. So let me preface it with saying I used to be that person. Why can't kids just be kids? Why are we trying to tell them that they're this and tell them that they're that? Just let them be kids, right? That's how I used to be. When I hear you say that there are people that are against early intervention, my empathy for that thought process would be that we are just on the cusp of realizing. I think at some point you wanted to talk about the language, and I would love to dive into that
Yeah.
if we have time because it's something that I feel was an important discussion. We are just now starting to realize that neurodiversity is probably not a neurominority. Or if it is a neurominority, there are so many of them that they're real, like this term of neurotypical, while we use it because we don't have another term that's more appropriate, our world is built around the neurotypical functioning expectations, societal norms, etc. And so we talk about neurodiversity in this way that means we are different from the
Different.
norm, right? We diverge from what is expected or what the
Right.
ideal outcome is. So when people talk about not wanting early intervention, I can empathize with the fact that, yes, in an ideal world, we would just accept that people function, process, communicate, and experience the world in different ways. And why should we have to try and do all of these things at age 3, 4, etc., just for them to feel comfortable showing up in the world? However, as much as I can empathize with that thought, I am a realist. We need to be realistic about the fact that those of us in the community and even neurotypical people that support the community The world is not built for us. It would not be this hard if it were that easy. If we could
Yeah,
just say,
I agree with you there in the regard of interpersonal relations and social interactions, communication. I would agree that it's not built for those different brains that, like you said, that are divergent from what we're calling neurotypical. And the other thing, though, when it comes to early intervention, that I think is really important to acknowledge that it's for the person who is having these challenges, like your nephew, it's not just about how that individual interacts with the environment and with the people in their environment. It's also about how the brain is actually processing the environment.
Mhm.
So, sensory processing is all these executive functions too. The more we can help the brain regulate in terms of sensory data, all the data that's coming in, and there are thresholds that are too high, thresholds that are super high, super low, that impact. If I'm overwhelmed by the lights flickering, all of the sensory things that happen, also just the executive functions that are very much a part of ADHD, which is emotional regulation and right reasoning, problem solving, memory, working memory, all of those things, even just the way the brain slows down or stops or pauses, all of is able to hold a moment here while I have to deal with this and the multitasking pieces of it. The more that we can help those brains as they're growing and developing, because some of that stuff is really problematic for the individual. It doesn't necessarily have to do with the environment around them. It's more, how is my brain processing the environment?
Absolutely. And we don't have support structures set up for those things when you're lacking diagnosis. If it appears that this person might not be strong here, we just give them these tools. We don't have that set up. We put a morality clause on it. If they struggle with organization or anything like that, it's you're lazy and you're not ambitious and you're not trying hard enough. For me, Jody, for the longest time, I truly thought I was going deaf because I felt like I was having so much trouble hearing people in conversations. I would even do the head tilt thinking this ear's not good. Let me do this. And got my hearing tested and it was fine. After being diagnosed with ADHD, and I suspect I might also be on the autism spectrum, but that hasn't been evaluated or diagnosed, but auditory processing disorder. It made so much sense that when you test my hearing, nothing is wrong with it. You can't measurably say, hey, I have hearing loss or I have a deficit. That's why to me, it makes me feel like I can't hear because my brain wasn't translating what was coming in fast enough.
It's funny you should use that example because let's talk about the definitions. Neurotypical versus neurodiverse or neurodivergent. The exact same experience that you just described with hearing. I have sensory processing differences. My family actually told me I was losing my hearing. 5, 7, maybe it was 10 years ago. I lose track of time because I had the same issue. I could not hear when there was background noise. Went and got tested. They told me that everything was fine about my hearing except when there was background noise. And they said, then your actual hearing plummets and you may even need hearing aids at some point, which for me has now been my AirPods with noise cancellation. That actually makes a huge difference if I'm in a
Mhm.
restaurant or in a loud place, if I have them in. But that's more neurological, sensory processing, auditory processing. I've had that experience, but I consider myself neurotypical, especially when you put me beside most of the people in my life and the people I work with who are autistic. So their neurodivergence is autistic neurodivergence. When you put me beside them, I seem more neurotypical. But yet I also have this sensory difference that's really significant for me in my life. I've got some visual differences too. It's like you said, these neuro differences. What was the word you used?
Minority. Right.
Neurominority. That's the word you used. Yeah, how do we go about identifying and what word fits? Let's talk about that. I know for me, I've started using mixed neurotype when I'm talking about people in relationship with one another, mixed neurotype. So we've got different neurotype. You might have this, you might have that. Sometimes people are autistic, sometimes they're ADHD, and the other is not. I have a lot of couples who one is autistic and one is ADHD, which is still a mixed neurotype. So let's just talk about how your brain is, what your brain's doing, and what your partner's brain is doing, and how that's different. How do we talk about these things? How do we use labels in a way that makes sense? Do you have any insights or thoughts on that?
Yeah. So, first, I want to preface it with I think language, when it comes to how we identify, is very individual because I just read on LinkedIn this person that had a literal complete opposite viewpoint that I do about the language that we use when we talk about neurodiversity. And they were very adamant to the point of saying it is inappropriate for you to label it this way. And I'm kind of like, but you don't get to say that though, right?
Right.
Because, it's okay for you to describe yourself in a way that you're comfortable with and ask others that are around you to use that terminology when describing you, but you don't have the right to speak for the entire neurodiverse community. And so I preface all of my statements with saying, this is how I feel about it.
Right.
Everyone is entitled to feel how they do because that is their lived experience and their preferences. For me, I use the term neurodiversity because in my mind, diversity is a beautiful thing, right? It speaks
Mm-hmm.
to the human experience and truly the experience of our entire world. There is
Yeah.
diversity in all living things. That is the beauty of the human experience is in these diversities that we have. When I first received my diagnosis, I initially was using the term neurodivergent because that was what I was familiar with at the time. But the more that I started to talk about it and the more that I started to think about the conversation with me included in it, right? To me, I view neurodivergent as having a negative connotation because, again, it gives this idea that like you have branched off from what is expected, right? Whereas diversity is that we are not meant to be the same, that we all have these nuanced differences. And that's another reason why I like the term neurodiverse is because I think it allows for the realization that there are so many types of neurodiversity. And we thought we could call it ADD, and now it's all these other things. In my personal opinion, I feel like the more research we do, the more that we are going to recognize that all of these things are linked because you see more and more nowadays the people that are diagnosed with both autism spectrum disorder and ADHD. I think they call it AUDHD. There's so much that we don't understand about the brain.
Yeah.
So for me, I don't think that there is a right way to talk about it because everyone has their preferences.
Gets into the semantics, the grammar of it in a way.
Yes.
I've seen that as well. I've seen that a good
Yes.
bit.
I don't think there is one right answer, but I do like the fact that we're starting to talk about these things. And I hope that it starts to help people recognize that our brains are not meant to be one way or the other. And the more that we work to understand how different neurotypes function and how the chemicals and the brain wiring and all of those things impact how they show up in the world, the more that we will hopefully be accepting of the fact that there is no such thing as normal and there's no such thing as typical.
True, and we've done personality psychology now for decades, and we understand version and introversion, thinking, feeling, intuitive. We really are grasping and understanding that. And I hope that in the next several decades, we start to understand our different brains. We may have percentages, even with personality types. We know that certain percentages are the more rare personality type, but we don't think of them as being wrong or
Right.
problematic or that they're divergent they're from the norm. It's just that they're more rare. And so I think with neurotypes, hopefully we're going to go in that direction where we'll be able to recognize all these differences in our brains, that nobody's really wrong or bad or the problematic, that's something that needs to be fixed to be
Mhm.
closer to the norm, but that we can just recognize the differences.
Yeah. No,
I
I
hope that's where we're
definitely.
going. In what way do you believe this neurotype that you have has influenced your own personal relationships in life, in family, friendships, romantic relationships, coworkers? How has it influenced what you bring to it and how you interact? As you can see, Gwen and I had a lot to talk about. And to hear her answer to my question, listen to the next episode in 2 weeks. See you then. Thank you so much to all of my guests of season 3 of the Your Neurodiverse Relationship podcast. These folks are bringing their lives to you to help all of you out there who are trying to figure out your own relationships. If you'd ever be interested in being on a podcast, just email us at gethelp@jodicarlton.com. Also, be sure to visit me online at jodicarlton.com to see all the resources that I have available to you. Until next time.